Any unauthorized use. Okay, we are recording. We are recording, as I said. Timing perfect. Well done, guys. Anyway, any unauthorized use or tampering with the recording is completely unacceptable. So, I figured that was the best way. This recording will be made available at the League of Women Voters website for those who were unable to attend or wish to revisit the conversation. During the course of our program, all Zoom participants will be muted. If you have a phone in the room, please be sure it's muted as well so we don't get any echoes or problems with our transmissions. To respond or ask questions for those online, please put your commentary in the chat box, which is usually located at the bottom of your screen. Carlin Reed will ably, as always, be monitoring the chat box. At the conclusion of David's talk, I will take questions from the audience. And I may need to repeat those questions so that the people online can hear them as well as the people in our audience here. We will try to get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. And I have several thank yous before we start. The first is to the library for this amazing facility. I mean, we are so blessed, and look at the technology and look at how it's working. I mean, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, everybody, and the trustees and all. And I want to thank as well Nancy Concord and Linda Zickford, our two tech whizzes who made all this work. I mean, like magic. And they've been really a fantastic tech team, and our remarkable Stefan Bader, who is coming over after he finishes cleaning up the last scoop of ice cream, who is my husband, who is our event specialist, and probably Linda's husband too. They're all over there cleaning up. I just heard a phone ring. Okay. And I also particularly want to thank Janet Miller, who may not be with us this evening, as she is in England. And she is the one who first connected our league's reading group with David Pepper's important work. She then wrote to him on either Facebook or Twitter, I'm not sure, and he amazingly responded. And the rest is history. So thank you, Janet Miller, and thank you, David. Those thank yous go both ways. David Pepper based the title of his book, mine is so written on right now, and inside that you can hardly see your original title. David Pepper based the title of his book, Laboratories of Autocracy, on Justice Louis Brandeis's famous 1932 dissent, in which Brandeis wrote, "It is one of the happy coincidences or accidents of the federal system that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the country. This commentary has been shortened and coined as simply and recognizably, state legislatures are laboratories of democracy." And I'm sure we've heard that phrase, many times, before in our collective lives. But David Pepper warns us that these laboratories are no longer benign, novel social and economic experiments. For, he writes, when we pull back the curtain and view clearly the assault on fair voting in this country by state legislatures, we observe how broad and aggressive the onslaught truly is. We are witnessing something much bigger, much deeper. It's a coordinated nationwide weaponization of state houses to undermine American democracy itself. And where it could lead, he continues, heading into 2022 and then 2024, even permanently, is downright frightening. One suspects, it's not a mystery, one suspects that President Biden must have read David's book when he gave a speech warning us that some do not recognize, quote, except the will of the people. They refuse to accept the results of a free election. And they're working right now.
Reboot the computer.
As I speak.
I did that earlier.
Speak.
There's somebody coming from you.
Okay.
Also, I understand that maybe muting, but maybe echoing online.
No, it was someone was unmuted, so I muted them.
Oh, thank you. Oh, now.
That's my job. Thank you. I was in the wrong.
So I'll have to thank you now for the texting too. So as Biden said, some do not recognize the will of the people. They refuse to accept the results of a free election. And they're working right now as I speak in state after state to give power to decide elections in America to partisans and cronies, empowering election deniers to undermine democracy itself. Jane Mayer, in her office piece in the New Yorker, praised David's work. And closer to home, our own Nancy Brown, when there's Nancy, wave Nancy, when she served as president of the Ohio League of Women Voters, knew well David's courageous work. David Pepper is a lawyer, a writer, a political activist, former elected official, and an election law adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. He graduated twice from Yale, once as a Phi Beta Kappa undergraduate, and again when he earned his JD from the law school. Now, in our world, when we say the law school, David, we usually mean that other place. I'll emphasize it is here. He has served as the chairman of the Ohio Democratic Party between 2015 and 2021. In that role, he was engaged in numerous fights and extensive litigation over voter suppression and election laws in the Buckeye State. Many previous elected roles have included serving on the Cincinnati City Council from 2001 to 2005, and he served as the commissioner of Hamilton County in Ohio from 2007 to 2010, and is president of that commission in his final year. In between his political offices and graduation from Yale, he spent 3 years in Russia, working for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Washington, D.C. think tank, where he served as a research intern for Brzezinski. And I can't see his first name, so I just decided to skip it. But David, if you later on want to say it appropriately for us, that'd be brilliant. But Brzezinski, could you say his first name properly?
Zbigniew.
Yeah, that's the reason I didn't do it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And spent time with such luminaries as Henry Kissinger and Paul Bremer, and such villains as Putin himself. Based on his time in St. Petersburg, Pepper has written 4 novels that bridge real-world politics and fiction, including A Simple Choice, which was freshly published this June in 1922. I can't wait to read it. His other work, the Wall Street Journal. I took it off, Bob. Excuse me for just a minute. Bob, you can't hear it because I was asked to take it off. Because it's echoing online. Online, okay. So I'm sorry.
Can he sit up here?
He perhaps can.
And look at 1922.
Oh, I always say 19. Because I'm not in the 21st century yet. Thank you. That's all right. I'm just kind of an old-fashioned girl. His first novel, The People's House, the Wall Street Journal praised as one of the best political, and praised him as one of the best political thriller writers on the scene. While his accomplishments are many, what we are here to appreciate this evening is his book, Laboratories of Autocracy. So thank you, David. The microphone is yours.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you all. Got a lot of things. I won't waste too much time on this, but I'm a massive fan of the League of Women Voters all over the country. Ohio's League of Women Voters has made an enormous difference in some of the topics we're going to talk about tonight, like trying to take on and end gerrymandering. By the way, one of the bad guys in my new book, A Simple Choice, is a Harvard Medical School professor. So we're going to have to go back and forth here. My brother, by the way, one other thing, my brother, some of you may have heard of, he is basically as a Celtics, Patriots, Red Sox fan. He went to Dartmouth and never has really come back to the Midwest. He runs a restaurant, some of you may have heard of, called Bo Loco. There are a number of them in Boston. So he's basically our Cincinnatian transplant to Massachusetts who's never come back. So it's good to be with you all tonight. I will speak for a few minutes. I'm really honored by the invitation. I'm excited about this event. I wish I had gotten some ice cream. I'm an ice cream nut myself, but I'm gonna do a PowerPoint, and I'm assuming, because you're the League of Women Voters, that actually most of you, unlike most of my audiences, have read the book. But I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of the book, some updated sort of analysis, and then really look forward to having a conversation. But let me start by going through a PowerPoint that, for those who haven't read the book, is a little bit of a review, although I think you'll find it compelling even if you have read the book. So let me start with a set of slides. This will take a little bit, and then we'll get into questions. But let me start by sharing this slides. Can everyone see this? Is the presentation up on the screen? Okay.
Yes, good.
Okay. Well, let me start off, and if you've read the book, you sort of know where this is going. But let me start off with really a hypothetical that basically is: what if we saw in another country the following things happening all at one time? We saw legislative elections rigged to a degree that we all could predict in advance 99% of the results. And so the minority party retained power, even if the voters voted for someone else, some other party. What if we saw the government of that other country attack the independent operations of elections and the vote counting process itself, so that that government, that party in control had greater control over the elections process? What if in that country, the party in power attacked the means by which the voters, the opposition party, voted, to make it harder or nearly impossible for the other side to vote in the ways that they preferred? What if we saw the other countries sort of do what we saw in places like Russia, basically deeming illegal or making it more difficult for the opposition to protest? What if we saw that country, and we've seen this in Hungary, attack the independence of courts that could hold them accountable when they violate the law? What if we saw that country violate the elected will of their own electorate that had been expressed through referenda repeatedly? They just simply ignored the will of their own people. What if we saw that other country violate their own constitutions repeatedly? What if we saw them change the law to protect themselves from being held accountable for corruption? What if we saw another country censor or cleanse its own history of elements that cast a bad light on what they were doing in the present day? What if we saw all this happen in rapid sequence? And we do see this in other countries. We've seen it in Hungary. We've seen it to an extreme degree in Russia. I believe that if you all saw, and I saw, and we as a country and Americans saw everything I described in another country happening all at once, we would say you have a 5-alarm fire going in terms of your democracy. You have an absolute crisis in terms of your democracy. Don't you think we'd say that, all of this at once?
Yeah.
The reason I wrote my book is because everything I just described is happening in our own country. Everything I described, remove party, remove sort of our own sort of within America lens, all the steps I have described are happening in state houses across this country in rapid sequence. Not one or two of these elements, but almost all of them is occurring, as I put here, in Columbus, Ohio, Tallahassee, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, Wisconsin. All these things are happening. If we saw them happening in other country, we'd call it out. But for a variety of reasons, and this is where I wrote my book, we don't see it in our own country nearly as clearly as we'd see it elsewhere. I think there's several reasons for that. One, we're overconfident in our democracy in America. We take it for granted. We can't imagine it would go away here like it does elsewhere. So even when there are threats to it, we don't see them. Number two, we think of politics in America so much around the politics of personalities. We focus on Donald Trump. We watch Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jim Jordan. We don't focus on the more boring institutional part of our democracy. So we might focus on every tweet from Mar-a-Lago, but we don't focus on the institutions that shape democracy, like states. And third, we especially don't focus on state houses. We don't pay attention. We don't know who these people are. We don't know what they do. So if all these things are happening at state houses, we just don't see it because we focus on Congress if we focus on anything. And normally we don't even focus on Congress. We focus on Marjorie Taylor Greene or AOC or something else. So I wrote my book because there is a crisis in American democracy. I'm worried that it is a 5-alarm fire, but because it's happening at a level we're not paying attention to, we don't see it. And I wrote my book to open people's eyes. It's not just about describing the problem, but as the subhead is, it's a wake-up call from behind the lines. Here's the problem. Here's what we can do about it. I'm going to do a quick summary of a little more about what I described before I get to what we can do about it. And I'm going to warn you, and you all know this, for a while, this is going to feel like a very dark presentation, okay? Quite sombering, just like the book is. But at the end, my hope is By confronting the problem for what it really is, we're all a lot smarter about how to solve it. So my hope is by the end, you're inspired that our action can do something more effectively than it's been doing. But I warn you, for a little bit, it's going to feel quite negative because I'm going to pile all the problems on top of each other. But I think if we don't confront them straight on for what they really are, we'll never actually solve them. So why state houses? Why are they the places that I described and that Diane described in her introduction as the laboratories of autocracy they've become? And when you read the book, I hope you get a sense of how to describe them tonight. They've sort of emerged for the same reason Brandeis saw them as being so potentially valuable. They've emerged as really, in many ways, as an Achilles heel of American governance now. And there's several reasons for that. The first reason, although it sounds counterintuitive when I describe this, is they're actually very powerful for the same reason Brandeis thought they could be the source of so much good. State houses in this country deal with virtually every single issue that any of us care about in our lives. The economy, healthcare, education, access to healthcare, quality of healthcare, access to education, quality of education, what's taught in our schools, energy, climate. And then just take a quick snapshot. What are the big issues debated in politics every day? A woman's right to choose, equality, gun reform or lack of it. That's all state house. The state houses really impact those issues and pass laws on those issues more than Congress ever does, all the time. So the first thing about state houses that we all need to appreciate, I put this in the book, they have an incredible amount of power over everything we care about. That sounds like a good thing in a way until you combine it with some other features that I'm going to talk about. But before we get to those other features, let's be clear, and this is lost on most American people. State houses also have an enormous impact on democracy itself. They generally are writing the first draft of the election rules of how our elections in this country are run, from everything from the local election up to the presidency. And usually the first draft is the final draft. It's state houses that determine in each state who votes, how they can vote, how they register, how they're knocked off the rolls, how long they have to vote. What do they have to do to get themselves on the rolls? Do they need an excuse if they're voting early? Can they have one drop box? Can there be one drop box in a county or 20? Can there be water in a line if they're stuck in line for a long time? How much voting equipment is there, et cetera? So they determine so many election rules, which we all know ultimately has some influence over who ultimately votes. They also, as we've seen all around the country in the last year and a half, they also draw the lines of our districts, our state house districts and congressional. Some states have reformed it, so there are other bodies that do it. But for the most part, the state house still either controls it entirely or has a major role in that process. So they're not only writing the rules of how elections are run and how votes are counted, they're also writing the rules about whether or not we have competitive districts or non-competitive districts. That's up to them. The third thing they control, as Donald Trump figured out a little too late in the process, but it's true, they have a major say in the presidential electoral process. So here we have state houses who don't only control every issue we care about, they also happen to have the major say in how the democracy of our country functions. A couple other things, I won't go in great detail here, but we also have found out, if you read the book, you see this, state houses in many states really can run rampant over federal, statewide, and local officials. They often will determine, there may be a Medicaid expansion as a federal policy, but state houses determine if that Medicaid expansion actually happens in a state. They can also designate how a lot of federal monies are spent, including recently COVID money. In a lot of states, these state houses can run over governors. They actually, in Ohio, for example, we saw a governor trying to do the right thing on COVID, run over by an extreme state house. They run over secretaries of state. They can run roughshod sometimes over state Supreme Courts, sadly. And they also, in many states, it could vary in Massachusetts. I don't know your laws there, but state houses often in many of these states can also run roughshod over local governance. They can write rules that override local home rule on everything from the wages, minimum wage, to plastic bag bans, to local reform of gun possession, for example, happens all the time. So they're not only important as a statewide matter, these state houses end up having major control and major leverage over other levels of government, which often are far better known than they are. To keep going. That sounds not like a problem. All I've described so far is that they're very important, very powerful. Here's where the Achilles heel comes in. And I use the old Spider-Man saying, with great power comes great responsibility. In this case, with their great power usually comes great anonymity. No one knows who these people are. I put in the book, the polling, people can name their governor, they can name their mayor, they can maybe name their member of Congress. Most people have no idea who their state rep is. They don't know what they do. They think it's a part-time job. It's kind of a mini Congress. I give stories about that in Ohio. That means generally these are very low profile elections, lost amid all the other ones. With local media dying, it's getting worse. There's very little media coverage of these places, not only the happenings at the state houses, but also the individual state house member. If that local paper's dying, well, no one's covering that local state house member. In many cases, they're far away in state capitals. Ohio, that's the case. Many states, that's the case. In many cases, these are very short sessions. So you add it all up, and this is a problem at any level of governance. You have a lot of power, but almost no one knows anything about these people. And that's a disconnect that's a real problem. There's an exception, though. There are a few people in these state houses who know exactly what these places do and what they can do for them. And I go through this somewhat in the book. You have interests at state capitals, be they, in some cases, energy companies, be it for-profit online schools like we've been saddled with in Ohio that are delivering terrible educations with a lot of public money. Far right-wing groups have figured out these state houses and get a lot of things done for them. So you have the average person having no idea what these places are doing. But in the state capitals, you have very important interests who know exactly what they're doing, and they really focus on these places. That disconnect, again, is dangerous. So this is all a problem. This is a problem going back generations. I'm going to add one more level of darkness to it that makes it far worse recently. And that is a problem that you all have been focused on, I'm sure, around the country. You have been in Ohio. So you don't need to hear too much about this, but I think it's an important part for most people. You throw in gerrymandering on top of everything I described, and everything gets far, far worse. And the 2011 gerrymander, and I'll go through this, in Ohio and other states was far worse than any time in the history of our country. Don't let anyone convince you, oh, it's the same as always. It's the same as it's always been. No, with computer technology, with the intensity of partisanship, the gerrymander of 2011 was far more extreme. And it made the problem of an anonymous state house far worse. And let me walk through that. 2008 and 2012, Obama won Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin by almost the same amount as he did in 2008. These are very good apples to apples comparisons of these states. And what they show you is, and I go through the details in the book. The 2011 gerrymander would offend every single good government bone in every member of League of Women Voters bodies. It was in a hotel room called the Bunker. It was intensely partisan. It was secret. And the League of Women Voters, to their credit, Ohio exposed it all after the fact, but the map was the map out of a horrific process. What happened in that 2011 gerrymander? Your Ohio members could have predicted the outcome of every election for the next 10 years based upon that map. But here's how bad it was immediately. In 2008, when Obama won Ohio by about 4 points, the state house and the congressional results pretty much followed his margin of victory. Democrats had 10 out of 18 congressional seats. Democrats had a slight majority in the state house. What you would expect in a state that Obama won by about 4 points. 4 years later, Obama won by almost the same amount, but the gerrymandering was so extreme that the 10-8 Democratic majority that reflected the breakdown of 2008 was flipped to 12-4 the other way. Same blue map, same Obama victory, Sherrod Brown won in 12, translated into a 12-4 supermajority congressional delegation. On the state house side, same problem. You'd expect the same about result of 2008 and 12 based on the map. A blue state became a red state in the state house, not because of the voters, but because of gerrymandering. This is not just an Ohio story, unfortunately. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, same pattern. The 2011 gerrymander was intense, and it basically took blue states and turned their legislatures red, even when, again, the voters were voting for Obama pretty decisively. That seems pretty bad, but let me make it even worse for you. 18 was a blue wave, even more than 12 in many of these states. And here I'm showing you 3 states. This isn't Ohio. Ohio was about 50-50 that year. It was such a blue wave that the congressional gerrymander was overcome and Nancy Pelosi became speaker. But at the state house level, and again, if you hear anything from me tonight, the most important mechanism in what's happening in our laboratories of autocracy is the gerrymander of the state house, even more than Congress. That's the most important gerrymander in the attack on democracy because it's where most of the damage is being done at the state house. Well, look how locked in they are in these state houses. Look at Wisconsin. This is the bar chart on the left of each state is how the voters voted across the state for state house. In Wisconsin, by 9 points, an absolute blowout, Wisconsin voters voted for a Democrat over a Republican for the state house. But look at how that translated in the actual legislature. 54-45 was still 2-1 Republican supermajority in the Wisconsin state house. That is handiwork that Vladimir Putin would admire. A minority party gets to be in the supermajority, even when the voters vote against them by 9 points. Same story in Pennsylvania, same story in Michigan. They managed to draw gerrymandering so extreme that they are in a majority they have not earned by the voters, not even close. That's the second level of how bad it is. Here's the third level, which is actually the worst of all. And this explains the out of control extremism you're seeing right now. Intense gerrymandering doesn't just earn them a majority that they don't earn. I mean, sorry, doesn't just give them a majority they don't earn by the voters. And I did not appreciate this until I wrote this book. By the way, I wrote this book in a frenzy. I wrote it about 3 months. I was so worked up. I had to get it out for people to read. It was like, you've probably written things like that too, just sort of frantic writing as fast as I could. But in that writing, I also did some research. And it's that the gerrymander is not only about majority control, it's about protecting extremism from voters who don't agree with it. And you'll see this. This is basically a summary of 10 years of elections in Ohio in the state house. They basically drew themselves 62 districts that they controlled. This is the average margin of victory in those 62 districts over an entire decade. And what you'll see is almost to a person, they never are in a real election. They never face accountability of voters. And that's what leads to the extremism. 17 of the 62 seats averaged a 50% margin of victory or more for 10 years. The next 21 averaged a 30% margin of victory or more for 10 years. The next 12, that's 50 total, were 60-40 or more, total blowouts. The next 12, double digits. So you're talking about, and we have 8-year term limits in Ohio, entire careers spent in power with no democracy. That's what they're creating. It's not just a majority when they don't earn the majority. It's total lack of accountability. It's no democracy at all in these state houses. And that is where, if you want to understand how does Ohio have a 10-year-old rape victim going to Indiana for an abortion when the average Ohioan supports Roe v. Wade, this is what explains that. They have basically created a system that extremism is protected from the people by this system. And I went through this in the book in some detail, but if you haven't read it, I want to talk about this because it really is an important concept. We all have a set of incentives that we assume emanate from a good, healthy, robust democracy. The accountability of a democracy leads to a set of incentives, and I felt them when I was in office. You want to deliver good public outcomes, and if you're in a fair district, because that's how you'll get reelected. Hey, I improved the schools, I lifted wages, I broadened healthcare access. That's what you do in a real democracy if you want to get reelected. You want to have something to tell the voters you did. If you're guaranteed your election result, no matter what, like these people were, public outcomes no longer matter. You get reelected even if the roads are worse and the schools are worse and wages go down. There is now a disconnect between public outcomes and getting reelected. That turns out to be very dangerous for the health of the states that have these gerrymandered systems. in a public system, in a robust democracy, you certainly are working with private entities, but if you're working with them to a point where you're reducing public outcomes, you're going to lose. But in a system where every election's guaranteed, you have a powerful incentive to serve those private interests, even if they're undermining public outcomes. If you're giving money to a for-profit online school that's taking money out of public schools and the education system collapses, in a real democracy, you would lose. But in a gerrymandered system where that private school is giving you money in your state house, you actually have an incentive to serve them, even if it undermines your public schools. In a broad democracy that's robust, of course, you generally are for things that the people support. You're for mainstream things. That's how you get reelected. You're doing things that reflect the people's wishes. If you're in a system where you're guaranteed to win no matter what, that's no longer the case. You're actually in a system where, believe it or not, you have an incentive to be an extremist. Why? Because extremism was what avoids your next primary. The next primary will be, if you veer too much to the middle, that's how you lose your next primary. So you have a system in place in these states where the incentive is not to be moderate. It's not to work with the other side. It's not to get things done. It's to actually be more extremist. So you have in these states an entire system, because of lack of accountability, where the incentives are all the opposite of what we think leads to good public service. I won't go through all of them in great detail, but you have one other very powerful incentive. It's third from the bottom. I should highlight it more. Once you've kind of gone down the road of these bad incentives where you're delivering bad public outcomes, you're an extremist, way out of touch with the mainstream of your state, there's one other incentive that's really important. You realize, if you're paying attention, if you ever had a robust democracy and voters had a choice, you would lose. You can't defend what you've been doing. You're an extremist. You're out of touch. You're sending 10-year-old rape victims to Indiana, even though less than 10% of your citizens agree with that. You can't defend your school system collapsing. So you have another incentive. You can never open up to have a robust democracy down the road, because you know that would be the end of your power. So we have all these really poisonous incentives coming out of these broken systems. Now, here's the other piece of bad news. I'm sorry, I know I warned you, right? They're the Achilles heel. The insiders know it. You've got all these perverse incentives. The other piece of bad news is I'm not the first person to figure this out. I'm not the first person to discover, although a lot of more progressive folks are figuring it out now. Other groups, and you've probably heard of ALEC, you know the Koch brothers, you know the NRA, they figured out this weakness a generation ago. They figured out that these state houses have very mixed up incentives. And unlike Congress, look at Congress in the last couple of days, the Senate doesn't want to touch the abortion bill because it's extreme, because it's unpopular. Who will? State houses, because they can do it, get away with it because of gerrymandering. So private national groups figured out a generation ago that state houses have all the mixed up incentives I've described. And if you want to do certain things, they are the place to go, not Congress. They are the place to go because they'll get it done and they can't be held accountable for it. And so for the last generation, I won't go, these state houses have not sort of independently done what I'm talking about. They've sort of been hot wired and weaponized so that they do it in concert. They do it together. The agenda is being pushed forward across these states, not just one state at a time. And what does that agenda look like? It looks like this. It's a whole lot of things that are generally unpopular, that wouldn't generally do well in Congress, that they didn't even try to do in Congress in 16 to 18 when Trump and the Republicans had every aspect of Congress in 16, 18, they didn't push most of this stuff through there. Why? Because state houses turned out to be the much better place to do it for everything I've described. ALEC didn't need to read Laboratories of Autocracy. They already understood it all. And they've been taking advantage of it for a generation. The book, though, is not only titled Laboratories of Autocracy to give you guys a catchy title. The truth is, they are operating as laboratories. They are always learning. They're learning from failures. They're learning from successes. And because dozens of states are doing it at the same time, there are many lessons to learn all the time. I won't go through this in great detail now, but I go through in the book. They're always learning as they go, and they've been learning for a generation. They have learned everything I just said earlier. The popularity of an issue does not matter in these state houses. They will pass it. They will push it, even if it's unpopular. Again, Kansas showed that attacking Roe v. Wade is not popular in these states, but the legislators don't care. Look, they're still passing these things right now. They don't care if it's unpopular. The system they're in rewards them for passing things that are unpopular. They care about secrecy to the extent it protects donors to groups like ALEC, but for the most part, as the officials, they don't care because they get reelected either way. They have learned, as I described, that legislators can overrun statewide officials. ALEC is not about governors, it's about legislators. Number 4, they've learned the more they throw forward, the better at once. I call the 80-20 rule. If you have a weak press corps that's weaker than it used to be, and you throw 100 issues forward, then maybe a few of them get a headline, the rest go through and no one knows anything about it, and they pass. So they've learned that, you know, in Congress, we watch a single bill move forward and it gets a lot of attention. In these state houses, they've learned, throw 50 of them forward, create chaos. And some of them maybe will get attention. Maybe a few will be controversial. Maybe 1 or 2 will get stopped by activists, but the other 30, they're going to go through and no one's going to see it. Number 5, they are always learning from successes and failures. If that Don't Say Gay bill passes in Florida, they do it in Ohio. If that abortion bill is upheld by a court, the other states will do it, et cetera, et cetera. So they're always learning. That's why if it feels like it's accelerating, it's because it is. If you have 20 or 30 experiments happening all at once and you're always learning, you keep going faster. That's why it feels like it's picking up in its pace. And the last thing they've learned, and this is quite a sobering thing for people who generally think about politics as about people, they have learned that the politicians actually in their system don't really matter that much. As long as the incentives are there, the politicians are doing the same thing over and over again. We've had in Ohio 3 speakers of the House in the last 5 years. Each one resigned in scandal. The next one would do the same thing. So what matters to them is not, they're not looking for the next Obama. They're looking for people who get into certain state house jobs and behave as the incentives would have them behave. So that line below here describes it best. What matters for them is that lack of accountability, which screws up all those incentives, and then everyone acts the same way, much more than finding incredible candidates who inspire people. They care more about those lack of incentives, which explains why accompanying all of this is a nonstop attack on democracy. That's the key. You can't have accountability or the whole system falls apart. The people can't have a real place at the table or the whole system falls apart. And from 2011, 2020, we saw this in a huge way. Everything from gerrymandering to attack, the Obama coalition was a massive threat to the folks in these states. It's what knocked them out of power in 2008 in that Ohio State House, Michigan State House. So they began through attacking early vote and voter purging and other things to attack the core elements of the Obama coalition, to getting them off the rolls, making it harder for them to vote, not giving them drop boxes, not giving them water, having long lines, rolling back early vote. That was all about keeping democracy at bay so you could continue what they did. They obviously attacked labor. About 6 years ago, we started to see a new type of attack, and this is fourth from the top. We started to see them directly undermine election outcomes. A Democrat would win a governor's race in North Carolina or Michigan or Wisconsin, and the state house, even though they only won because of gerrymandering, would immediately start stripping power away from the winning statewide candidate who actually won a majority of the votes. They take away the powers that they had so they couldn't fulfill their promises. We saw them start to change the way you elect Supreme Courts of states like in North Carolina. Why? Because they were threatened by the fact that Democrats had won Supreme Court seats in places like North Carolina, Ohio. The last one on the list, and you'll recognize this from the opening slide, then they started to simply ignore citizen-led ballot initiatives that pass it directly. In Maine, in Florida, in Missouri, and now Ohio, the voters literally voted decisively to end, felon disenfranchisement in Florida or to do Medicaid expansion. And these state houses simply wouldn't do it. So you start to see sort of previews of right now, election denialism. They would simply ignore statewide elections that they didn't like. Even though they were in these false majorities in these state houses, they would ignore real majorities as had been voted on in these states. And that's when we really start to see a preview of what we're seeing now. And we're seeing, again, I go through the lessons. What did they learn through the last decade? They can do all this stuff and then some, and it works. And they're never held accountable for it. So you're seeing that they learned over since 11, attack the voters of the other side, ignore election outcomes that you don't agree with, and you're never held accountable for it. And they've learned that lesson again and again and again. So 21 and all that we're seeing, and this is a really important point, it's not some new thing because of the big lie. It's an extension of everything that came before. And I think this is a really important, the framing that all this came because of January 6th is just not right. Everything in 21 on is an extension of what began in 11. Rigging elections through gerrymandering again. You know, the attack on drop boxes in 2021 is the same thing as the attack on early vote in 2011. It's the same exact tactic. The stripping power of elections officials is very similar to what they did to governors when they didn't like the results in 1618. Now, there are new levels of alarm. You know, they're legislating the big lie. They're stoking vigilantism when they say that you should challenge elections officials in their face and tell people in Texas, you know, sue to stop abortions you don't like. Go sue people. That's a new layer and a new level. But all this is an extension, as is censoring history. So there are new alarm bells ringing. But what I don't like about the broader frame from some is as if this is some newfound thing in 21. It's not. So that's sort of the, I'm about to get to the positive, by the way, and then go to questions. So big picture, here's where we are right now. And this is maybe a challenging slide for some, but I really believe this. And Jane Mayer touched on this in her story. I believe that we all view sort of naively that we're in a single battle over politics in America. But I actually think it's much more sort of accurate to see that there are two battles going on. They're very different. Unless in one side, the side on the left of the slide doesn't see the other side's battle, and because of that, it keeps losing the battle. And the side on the left is, I think, mainstream America. My guess is it's Democrats, it's independents, it's the media, it's most members of the League of Women Voters everywhere. This side has generally for a long time viewed democracy as intact, which is a very privileged view, by the way, that it's like a post-1960s view that democracy is just stable. It's going to be here forever. It's stable, it's intact. That's not our history, by the way, and that's not the world's history, but that's how we see it. And this side also, and this is generally going to be Democrats, this side actually is quite confident that its viewpoints on the world are the mainstream viewpoints of the world in politics. Roe v. Wade is a popular thing to be for. Battling climate change, that's mainstream. Common sense gun reform, that's mainstream. These are all majority supportive viewpoints. A middle-class based economics versus trickle-down, that's a majority supportive viewpoint. So this side viewing democracy as intact and also being confident that it represents a majority viewpoint on most issues, this side's political battle is a battle in its mind of winning election outcomes. If we win elections, this side thinks we win the battle and we win the political American political battle. And this side very quickly decides, well, to win that battle, we're better off focusing on federal elections, because if we win the White House, the Senate, and the House, we win. And so this side quickly decides that the battle is over swing states and federal years. So this side's battle is, let's win elections, do what we want to do when we win them. And the way to do that is to win a certain formula of swing states to get us the Senate, the presidency, the House. And so this side gets especially excited in swing states and federal years. Does that pretty much sound like one side's battle? Like kind of the way that most people, that's the way it's covered. That's how we think about it. The other side, as I've described here, has quite a different battle. The other side, first of all, understands that democracy itself is not stable, that it can be subverted, that the history of this country is that it is subverted. It has been many times, that it can be subverted in other countries like it has been in Hungary. In this side, and this is where I'd throw, people say, well, who are you talking about? I'm talking about the Koch brothers or the extreme anti-choice groups or the extreme, gun groups. They actually understand, watch Mitch McConnell's behavior. They understand that they actually represent a minority viewpoint. They understand that if they were in a robust democracy, being for the things that they're for would actually cost them the next election. That's why Mitch McConnell tells Rick Scott to stop talking. That's why Mitch McConnell told Lindsey Graham to stop talking about his new ban. They understand that in a robust democracy, they have a minority world viewpoint that would lose, just like it did even in Kansas. But they don't quit because they understand that. They choose a different battle. Their political battle isn't over election outcomes in a robust democracy. Their battle is over democracy itself. How to keep it at bay enough, how to subvert it enough that they can lock in their minority worldview on an ongoing basis. And once they've figured out that that's their battle, what is their strategy? It's everything I've described in my book. It's states and state houses. The best place to go to subvert democracy, to put into place a minority world viewpoint, are states and state houses. And unlike the side on the left, this side therefore goes for broke in states around this country, not just in federal years and not just in swing states. Every state they can get their hands on, every single year. And once they win, they lock that state down through gerrymandering, voter suppression, other things we talked about. And then they get that minority agenda put into place like they have in Ohio and Florida and other places. That's the other battle. These are the two battles. And I ask you, before I move on to the positive stuff, who's going to win the battles I just described if each side does what I just described? The side on the right is. It's pretty obvious. They're battling every single year in every state, and whenever they win, they lock that state in and move to the next state. The side on the left is only fighting every couple of years in a few swing states, and they're ceding the rest of the territory to the other folks who are battling every single year. This, I hope, is the aha moment for people who haven't seen it before. The side on the left here, and I don't mean left politically, I mean the side that cares about democracy, needs to figure out that the side on the right is in a battle for democracy itself. That's the battle we are in right now as a country. And until we see that, the side that cares about democracy will continue to see democracy go the wrong way. So what do? There are 5 steps. I put 30 steps in my book. I'm going to summarize them in 5 tonight. The side that cares about democracy has to see that that is the battle we're in. We're not in a narrow battle over the next cycle over a few elections. We're in a much deeper battle for democracy itself, and we have to go to that battle, engage in that battle, or we will not succeed. What does that mean? It means 5 things. To summarize my 30 steps in 5 steps. 1, the battle for democracy has been our entire national history. This is not a new battle. John Lewis would say to us, what do you think the battle was? What do you think I was fighting for? And once you see that you're in a battle for democracy itself, you also adjust and you understand, oh, this is a long battle we're in. It's not just about the next cycle. It's not just about registering voters in September for a November election. It's about a much bigger picture battle. And that means everything we do must be with that big picture in mind. And when I say big picture, not to depress anyone, but I'm talking about suffragists who fought so their great-granddaughter would vote 70 years after Seneca Falls. I'm talking about John Lewis. I'm talking about people who spent their whole lives fighting for democracy. That is the fight we're in. And we better see that. Once you see it, I hope it's inspiring that we're in the same historic fight that we've been in our whole nation's history. And it's almost been a privileged view to think that that wasn't the fight we were in. But that's the battle we're in. That's the battle I know League of Women Voters has been in your whole existence. But who's a good example of how do you succeed when you have that fight in mind? Stacey Abrams. She understood that the battle for Georgia's democracy was a long battle. She didn't simply assess her results on a federal cycle. Stacey and I are friends from law school. So not only did she clearly take classes I didn't take, but she also, I've been watching her ever since. She has been engaged in a long-term battle for democracy in Georgia, and that's why she succeeded. Even when, she started nonprofits to fight voter suppression. She was the minority state house leader in Georgia. She then ran for governor, and every step of the way, she kept making progress. To the point where in 2018, she didn't win her governor's race, but she announced the night after she's basically didn't concede, but said, I'm not going to be governor. She said, we made progress. My guess is people didn't believe that, but you know what? She knew more people voted for a Black woman in Georgia than anyone could ever imagine. And she knew that more voters had registered than anyone could ever imagine. She knew progress because she had a long game mentality. And 2 years later, who was right? She was. We need to all be thinking about the battle for democracy in the way she did long-term in Georgia. Number 2, and we did this in Ohio around our Supreme Court races, but I'll skip that for now. Number 2, once you see we're in a battle for democracy itself, you realize how unacceptable it is that we only are fighting this battle in about 8 or 9 states. If it's a battle for democracy itself, we need democracy in 50 states. We have to fight that battle. Everyone in this country is entitled under the Constitution to have a state-level government that is a democracy. And we can no longer accept not fighting for that in many states simply because they don't happen to be a swing state for a federal election. And we need to all start thinking about how do we fight for democracy on 50. A state can be red, but even a red state should be a democracy where people have choices and where that legislature reflects that state. And there are a lot of red states right now, like Kansas, that don't support the attack on abortion, but you wouldn't know it because they're no longer really a functioning democracy at their state house level. I go through a lot of more specifics in the book, but the second key step is once you realize you're in a battle for democracy, we can no longer accept only fighting for this battle in 8 or 9 states for a lot of reasons. The other reason is if you let the extremism that comes with these gerrymandered state house go unchecked in 30 states, guess what? It explodes. It explodes. The reason extremism is blowing up all over this country is because in too many states, there's only one side talking. The other side's not even in the game. And that's how extreme, if there's only one side talking, guess what? We saw it happen with the Republican Party with Donald Trump. The extremism will take over. And that's what's happening when we only challenge extremism in a few states. Number 3, the same thing goes within a state. Dozens of districts are all around this country in states like Arizona, Georgia, Ohio, are simply not being challenged. And so you're seeing within states, red areas that are becoming extremist bastions, even though they weren't 20 years ago, because there's only one side in the game. And you also, if you believe my observation that the anonymity of state house is a big part of the problem, well, if you don't run people in 20 out of 99 districts, then that's millions of people who don't even hear about their state house because there's no one running on the other side pointing out what it's doing. We have to have an all district, all state strategy. And in case that sounds sort of pie in the sky impossible, thinking, let's say financially, if you look closely, we actually know how to give money when we get excited. We give hundreds of millions of dollars to US Senate races because we've told our low dollar donors that's how we're going to save democracy, to the point where we literally have $100 million being spent to try and defeat Mitch McConnell in Kentucky in a race we weren't going to win. At the same moment, we have dozens and dozens of districts in states like Ohio, Georgia, and Arizona, swing states where no one's even running. So I would suggest take 30 million and 100 million and give it to those people. So the dollars are there, the volunteer energy is there, but we have not said in a broad way, oh, if you're fighting for democracy, we can no longer allow races to be uncontested or unsupported all over this country. It's making the problem far worse if we're not competing everywhere when it comes to extremism and the attack on democracy. Two other quick things. I hinted at this earlier. This is step 4. This is not just about never Trump. And it's a mistake when we think that. As I said, the attack on democracy, the most recent iteration came after Obama won, long before Trump decided to run for office. If Donald Trump had admitted he lost the day after the election, it would have continued. They still would have attacked drop boxes. They still would have taken water away from people along lines in Georgia. They still would have gerrymandered. If Donald Trump were locked up tomorrow for whatever he's got in that, stored away in Mar-a-Lago, if he were locked up tomorrow, the attack on democracy would continue. We have to stop framing it as only about Trump. Because when we do that, we are actually giving cover to a whole lot of people who may not sound like Trump. They may not even say they're MAGA, but they're attacking democracy every single day. And I go through examples. If you ban drop boxes, even if you didn't like Donald Trump, you're attacking democracy. And so my worry is if we only make it about Trump, we are hiding from the American people. Actually, there's a lot more going into this attack on democracy than just whatever Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene say. And we give cover to people who are attacking democracy because they happen to be more polite or civil than Donald Trump is. So I go through more details in the book, but that is a key observation. This is deeper. A lot of you will know the history. It'd be as if when Jim Crow began to arise in the South, people would say, hey, this is about Andrew Johnson. No, it's much bigger. That's almost ahistoric to make it about one person. It's much deeper than just about one person who happened to be president 4 years. Finally, and I'll stop with this, my hope is, and you're already doing a lot of this, so I won't go on about this, but my hope is that once people see that we're in a battle for democracy, they see that there's a lot more they can do in their own lives to lift democracy than they do. Not just a few volunteer hours, helping a candidate or giving a little money. All of us have a footprint of influence. And in many of these states, there's so many ways you can lift democracy. I give it examples in the book. Sherrod Brown, when he was Secretary of State of Ohio, he had McDonald's have on every tray in Ohio a voter registration form. Any business in Ohio and any state could do that. If you're on the board or volunteer at a homeless shelter, is that homeless shelter registering people who come through? How about a food bank? How about a rec center? How about a library? The very people being purged in some states like Ohio and Georgia are the people who would walk into that city rec center or that health clinic or that library. Is everyone taking all their footprint in lifting democracy? And the reason I bring this up is the attack on democracy is a full-time, big money operation. And if all we do is take a little bit of our volunteer time and fight for democracy, I worry that we will not have the scale to succeed. We have to start incorporating our fight for democracy into everything we do every single day to the extent that that's appropriate. That's why a restaurant, a nonprofit, a city hall, all of them could be fighting for democracy. Making sure that every state house district has a candidate. Making sure you're helping people beyond just a candidate who's in a swing district. We have to go way beyond our typical participation. Stacey Abrams is wonderful. She's not going to save us. She's going to help. But the power to save us will come when all of us figure out in our own lives, what can we do to lift democracy? And when we all start doing that, that's when I think we reach the scale of what it will take to start pushing back against this onslaught. And I go back through, I'm really inspired. I've been reading a lot of our civil rights leaders. And I'm so inspired by not just John Lewis, but a lot of others. When you read closely the quotes that they're so famous for, in some ways we read them as if they're speaking to their fellow leaders in the past. But now I read them, they're talking to us now. You read Mary McLeod Bethune, you read Robert Kennedy and how a small wave leads to a ripple. You read John Lewis. These are people who lived it, who are still telling us now what we need to be doing. Freedom is not a state, it is an act. I mean, that's now. It is not some enchanted garden perched on a high distant plateau. That's kind of how we've been thinking about it for the last generation, where we can finally sit down and rest. It's continuous action. And so my hope is once you see the problem, it inspires a lot of thinking about what more we can do. And I'll just simply close by saying, I'm often asked, well, is it too late? You've described a pretty sobering picture. Is it too? No, it's not too late. It is a historic battle for democracy. It's only too late if you don't ever get in it. So if you've been in it, like you all have been in it, then it's obviously not too late. And if you jump in tomorrow, get in, we can do this. It's late. The other side has a head start. But if we all, put our shoulder to the wheel and start focusing in a bigger picture way than we have been, it certainly isn't too late as long as we get going. So with that, I'll stop talking. Would love to open up to a good conversation. Thanks, everybody. I hope that was
David, that was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to remind people online that they can put their questions for David in the chat box, and Carla Reed will be looking for them. And I don't see a lot of those yet, but please do so. I'm going to ask for questions from the audience in a minute, but I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the moderator by asking the first question, David, if that's okay.
Yeah.
In your conclusion, you offer, as you suggested, 30 strategies for addressing our present political condition. And incidentally, I just have to say, Alec used to mean to me Alec Guinness. And, this has just changed the whole thing entirely. But in any case, which do you believe citizens in a small town like Concord should undertake first?
One thing I put in the book, and I can't speak to Massachusetts laws, but you'll note in the book that before you try and save the day in Ohio, I think every state that is a blue state needs to have the best, most accessible voting process possible to be a laboratory of democracy. And so before, one of the reasons we know drop boxes are so effective and vote by mail early, no fault is so effective, is because Washington State and Oregon did those things when they could. And so I would first make sure, and I'm sure you do this, that Massachusetts is at the highest level possible. So those of us in other states can learn from best practices. So before you help us make sure that your own state, and not all blue states actually are living up to this. In fact, I go through the book. New York State was often thrown in my face by Republicans. Well, they don't have early vote. They're terrible. So why do you say we? So we need to make sure we need to live by our values in the states where we think pro-democracy and you know, again, I know you are nonpartisan, so I don't mean to lump you with Democrats. I understand that. But Democrats talk as if we are pro-voters, right? Well, when we're in power, we better be. And if we're not, that's when groups like yours and others should make sure that we are. Because it's used against democracy when we're not. And we learn so many positive lessons when states are laboratories of democracy when it comes to democracy itself. But secondly, what I would say is, if you are in this, I speak to a lot of groups. There are ways that people in states that don't feel like they're in the kind of, by the way, one of the worst things about my book, although it was good in a way, but very sobering, how many people read my book and literally wrote me, oh my God, you just described my life in Tennessee. You just described Florida. You know, most of my Zoom calls are with states that are like Ohio, and people just are so frustrated. They don't live in a democracy. You can help those states if you want to. Now, again, I don't think the League of Women Voters could do that directly, because some of this stuff will be more political, but there are many groups in blue states that are adopting red states. They're finding priority state house seats that might lead to that state no longer being a jury. Someone just asked, how do you undo gerrymandering? I was on a group call the other night where a group from New York adopted Pennsylvania. Arizona is only 2 seats away from no longer having a, you saw what Arizona did, the fraud it. Well, they're only 2 seats shy of a Democratic majority. Well, a lot of California groups are adopting Arizona and helping those candidates with money and volunteering, and we'll go there. Did any one of you know this fabulous actress from Succession named J. Smith Cameron? She was up for an Emmy the other night. I don't watch Succession much, but she is a rock star. When she walked into the Emmys, she didn't get the award, but she was nominated. She had a Bands Off Our Bodies purse she was wearing. It was photographed everywhere. She's part of a group that's adopted Pennsylvania, and she's got all these actors and actresses with her. They're going to volunteer. So if you're interested in that, there's a group called the States Project, and they help, and I can introduce you. By the way, I'm going to give you my email address if anyone wants to follow up on anything. Email me and I'll introduce you. If you said, hey, I got a group that would adopt, a state, and we would help there, they pair you up with that state and they tell you, here are the races that could make a difference. And all of a sudden you're helping. My guess is you also, though, in a pure League of Women Voters way, we need to in states like Georgia and Ohio, the purging is so brutal that the registration needs to be 24/7 every single day, all year. If we simply wait for the candidate to do it, it's too late. And so that would be my other thing, is when you're done helping make sure Massachusetts is best in class, maybe reach out to the Ohio League of Women Voters and say, what can we do to help you register voters there? Because so much of the battle against democracy is purging voters that they think will vote against them.
Absolutely.
And it's the number, if you've read my book, the numbers of people purged from our big cities in Ohio is the most depressing thing you've ever seen. We're a different state because of it. People didn't die or move. They just got knocked off the rolls because they're poor and they move a lot within the county, not out of the county. So to the extent you could partner up with League of Women Voters outfits in states where that's a big problem, there is absolutely a need for registration. And someone did ask about ending gerrymandering. Anything you all can do to help push state, the Senate and others to, there's a bill in the Senate right now that would basically add so many rules around gerrymandering. They need to get it through. I get a little fired up, so I don't want to sound like I'm just some angry guy, but I'm livid that the U.S. Senate did not pass the voter protection laws as the first thing they did.
Absolutely.
Chuck Schumer should have said to Joe Manchin, hey, you want infrastructure? He should have said this a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
You want infrastructure? We need you to vote to protect voters. And that protection included protections against gerrymandering. So to the extent, and you guys fortunately have one of the firebrands, we need every U.S. senator that's a Democrat to be fighting harder for this than they are. I mean, Elizabeth Warren's fighting hard, so she doesn't need the memo. But there are too many Democrats, not just Manchin Sinema, who are, you wouldn't know democracy was on the line if you watched them right now.
No.
They had one vote in Ohio. The Republicans violated the Ohio Constitution 7 times as they gerrymandered. They just keep doing it.
Nobody's.
The Democrats had a single vote on voting protections in January, and they've walked away and never brought it up again. Now, you tell me who's going to win. If one side keeps going no matter what in the way I described, and the other side quits after one vote, never brings up again, the side attacking is going to win. And so to the extent you can kind of get on Democrats to say, fight harder, that also would help. So that's some of what you could do. The 30 steps go through a lot more.
Terrific, David. We have some questions here that you can't see in the real live audience here. Why don't you start?
Well, I have to interrupt you, David. Indivisible, indivisible.
Yeah, you know what I'm going to ask you to do? You can come around here and speak here so that the people on the screen can hear you.
I want to get on the, I want to get on
right
the,
here.
oh, right there.
The camera's right there.
Where?
Yeah, come right here and speak into the microphone so
Okay,
everybody
so-
can hear you. And
There you are.
I want to get on the soapbox to all of you, including you, David, about Indivisible. It's an it's a national network. We have Indivisible Concord, we have Indivisible Acton. I just know a little bit more about the stuff that Acton is doing. And David, you talked to us about 6 months ago, Indivisible Acton area. And Indivisible, I mean, every chapter is a little different, but Indivisible Acton area is doing everything that David has described. And you just become a member. Every week we have 2 newsletters with a slew of activities where you can go help in Pennsylvania, you can write postcards, you can phone bank, and we concentrate on municipal, state level elections as well as federal. And we have a whole slew, we curate activities across the country. We tell you where you can target your donations, your labor, your hours, just sign up. And we have a particular tool we call Purple to Blue. It's very specific. And we have very dedicated members who spend a lot of time reviewing and vetting organizations and efforts to verify efficacy. So remember, IAA. And David, in your talks around the country, talk up the Indivisible Network. We are actually very effective, and we can be more effective with more members. Thank you.
Let me just echo. I couldn't agree more. We would never have gotten the signatures that we needed to get our gerrymandering protections. I mean, Indivisible drove so much of that. A lot of my Zoom calls are with Indivisible leaders around the country. So no, it's been so much of that energy post 16 emerged through Indivisible. You guys saved us in Ohio. And that's why whenever I get invited to an Indivisible meeting like I did with Acton, I join up because that grassroots leadership is key right now.
Great.
Question in the chat, perhaps?
Now another question from our group here. Oh, there must be one.
Okay.
Vince.
Maybe you can relay this to David.
I hear you.
Yeah, he
I can
hear
hear
you,
that.
but
We can
the
hear it.
Audience online may not be able to, Vince, so go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay. sir.
What's happening on the local level with school boards? Is that an ALEC type of, kind of expansion of their state activity or what?
So the
Great question. So
David, I'm going to repeat it for people
Okay.
online to make sure everybody can hear it. Is ALEC, are such organizations also influencing school committees? And what's going on there?
yes, again, not to add a layer of darkness to this. ALEC has become the model of how other groups are now working. So now other groups also, and there's some sort of, the Heritage Foundation is basically organizing states to attack voters and voting rights. But there are also some Christian right groups that are now organizing states in the way ALEC did. So everyone's basically figured out, we don't need to join ALEC. We just redo what they've done. And my worry is that that's what's happening. I haven't studied as much as I need to, but that kind of nationalization of that approach is happening with school boards. And what people have figured out is that all these offices impact democracy. And now we know, it shouldn't be a secret, but the teaching and the subject matter of what's in libraries and schools has a massive impact on our current understanding of our democracy. So of course, public schools and what's taught there and what's banned there, just to name one example, are a huge part of democracy. And so it's just a broader notion of having good public schools to begin with versus funneling all the money to other things. So yeah, that is the most recent front in the war on democracy. And it is scary. We saw in Ohio, you probably saw it there, very intense effort last November with a lot of money. Now, the good news is in Ohio, believe it or not, even in Republican areas, parents voted against, for the most part, these very right-wing people who had been put up to run for school board because they don't want the crazy in their schools. They may not know what's going on in the state house, but they know their kids are in their schools and they don't want that. So in Ohio, the first round, a lot of the more sort of grassroots normal school board leaders actually survived elections against some big money opponents. But to your question, we got to be prepared because it's going to come more and more intensely. Because again, it's another front line on democracy, just like state houses, libraries. And here's another way we got to think about it, by the way. On the Democratic side, again, I know you're not nonpartisan, but I'll just say on the Democratic side, the Democrats too often say, oh, you got to elect state reps and school boards because that's your bench for the future. And the answer is, well, and maybe for some, but it's also the present front line of democracy. So don't just talk about it as if it's some part of it's the minor leagues. If you have a good school board member shaping a good school system, I don't care if they ever leave. That's the best thing they could do. So we can't, again, that's the sort of Democrats have a federal swing state mindset that shapes everything else. And so when you hear them say, well, we got to elect the state rep because that's a bench for the future. No, that's the people protecting democracy right now. And if they never run for Congress, they're still doing something really important. And we have to think about these positions in that way, just like we do with school board as well.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. Carlin, do you have some questions from the chat box?
Yes, I have a couple.
Yes. I'm sorry, I'm hearing something. We'll get one from the floor in a minute. Go ahead.
Yes, I have a couple. I'm going to speak into your microphone. One I have is, where does ranked choice voting at the municipal and state levels fit in this picture?
Wait, say that again?
Ranked choice voting.
Right.
Danielle Allen, a Harvard scholar and a woman who ran for governor here in Massachusetts, was interviewed the other day at our First Parish Church. We asked her, what is the one thing, if we gave you a magic wand and you could just do one thing to influence politics, she said, get ranked choice voting in place. And when you look at what happened in Alaska, it does become somewhat compelling. So what do you think?
Yeah, the more I'm alarmed, the more I'm pretty open to sort of more game-changing reforms. I worry. I think, and this is why I focus so much on the book on this. I think the nearest term best practice reform that's likely most feasible in a lot of states is either an independent commission drawing districts like past Michigan, or ground rules that really curb partisan gerrymandering, like is in the Senate bill that's sitting there not getting voted on. I think those are a little less complicated and a little less difficult to attack. I think now that we saw what we saw in Alaska, any attempt to do ranked choice voting in states like Ohio will be met by millions and millions of dollars from special interest money to defeat it. But we showed in Ohio that 70% of Ohioans voted to end gerrymandering. Now the legislature is ignoring that. So I think in my sort of waterfall, let's try and end gerrymandering wherever we can. But I also think the Alaska approach of a one primary and the top four go to a runoff with ranked choice is actually a very good way to get the extremism out of the primary and to motivate being more mainstream. So I like it, but did you see how upset the Republicans were that Palin didn't win? Like, they're not going to just sit back and let that happen. And so I think it's certainly clearly, it reflects the voters better, and it gets you out of this race to the extremes. It's really destroying politics. But my near-term priority, if you hear anything what I said today, it's the gerrymandering that is poisoning. It's the key feature at the state level that's destroying everything else. And I think there's ways to get rid of it, even if we don't get to the ranked choice voting.
Okay, there are so many interesting questions around, but we're gonna have to say goodnight to you now. We want to thank you so much for joining us, David. It's meant the world.
Wait, his email.
Is this it? Are we done?
Oh, your email address. We need your email.
Okay, let
address.
me put it up again.
Okay.
Oh, I have it.
And by the way, what's funny is I did start out my book writing with novels, and my first novel was all about gerrymandering, by the way. I had to spice it up with some plots, but my novels are sort of some people think better through storytelling than nonfiction. So my novels are all about politics. There are a lot of reality checks about politics. So, if you like this book and want to read some fiction on the side, I write them as well.
I've already ordered 2 of them.
Oh, good.
And your email address is David Pepper.
David Pepper, 4 Ohio, the number 4, it's the number 4, Ohio at gmail.com.
At gmail.com.
And by the way, I'm trying to write a follow-up book to Laboratories. It's like a handbook it skips right to the steps.
Good.
It says, okay, the other book you've read, this is a shorter, I call it sort of a democracy champion's handbook of how to get involved. So I'm working on that right now as well. And I'm going to try and get that done in the coming months, if I can squeeze it in. For those of you who want to really get into how the 30 steps in the book go through a lot, but this would spell it out in even more detail with case studies and good programs like the States Project I mentioned.
Fantastic. And as you know, Tim Schneider did a beautiful job in identifying concerns about democracy. And so the combination of his book, short, pithy, effective, and yours would be just a perfect couplet as a handbook.
Yeah.
David, thank you so much. You're so great.
Good. Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed it. Honored by the invite. Keep doing what you're doing. I really appreciate the energy of this group.
And we look forward to checking in with you again.
Great. Yep. Stay in touch.
Time
Thanks.
progresses. Okay,
See ya.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.